Hey everyone, I am still shaking from reading this one. The level of toxic elitism and straight-up evil parenting we are looking at today belongs in the Am I the Devil subreddit Hall of Fame. Just a trigger warning. We are dealing with some massive financial sabotage by a father to his own son. Let's get into it. My parents handed my brother a cool $135,000 while I got absolutely nothing toward a life. They looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a pathetic failure, so I vanished. I cut off all contact. They even secretly sabotaged my very first business loan just to see me crawl. But 3 years later, my golden child brother accidentally drove past my hidden 7-acre property and frantically called our dad yelling, "You need to get down here right now. We've made a terrible mistake." Can you even imagine the psychological toll of being told by your own flesh and blood, straight to your face, that you're not worth a dime, while they hand your younger brother a fortune for a luxury Manhattan condo? That's my story. And let me tell you, that cutting, vicious remark, combined with their hidden betrayal, ignited a roaring fire in my gut that changed absolutely everything. My name is Arthur. I'm 36 now, and I'm a custom construction contractor from Pennsylvania. Growing up in a fiercely competitive, affluent suburb of Philadelphia, appearances weren't just important, they were our entire religion. Our house was a sprawling colonial, and my parents, Robert and Eleanor, made sure it was a pristine fortress of upper-middle-class perfection. My father, Robert, was a senior commercial loan officer at a major regional bank. He was a man who measured human worth in credit scores, zip codes, and the brand of watch strapped to your wrist. My mother, Eleanor, sold high-end real estate to doctors and corporate executives. Together, they were the absolute picture of proper suburban elites, commanding the country club social scene with practiced, hollow smiles. And naturally, they expected nothing less than Ivy League perfection from their two sons. From my earliest memories, the hierarchy in our home was painfully, suffocatingly clear. My brother Kevin, for years my junior, was the undisputed golden child. He was destined for greatness before he could even tie his own shoes. Kevin was naturally brilliant in the way traditional schools love. He could memorize a textbook, ace a standardized test without breaking a sweat, and spit back facts with a charming, arrogant smirk. Me? I was the problem. Not because I was getting into trouble with the law or running with a bad crowd, but because my brain simply didn't fit into their rigid, white-collar definition of success. While Kevin was pulling straight A's and winning debate tournaments, I was staring out the window, visualizing how the school building was framed. I would study until my eyes bled just to pull off C+s and B-minuses. "Why can't you just apply yourself like Kevin?" became the soul-crushing soundtrack of my entire childhood. Every parent-teacher conference ended with my father's tight-lipped, furious disappointment and my mother's forced, embarrassing apologies to my teachers. But what my parents never saw, or perhaps actively chose to ignore, was that I possessed a completely different kind of intelligence. While Kevin lived in the abstract world of equations and historical dates, I had an intuitive, almost spiritual understanding of the physical world. By the time I was 10, I could dismantle our lawnmower, diagnose a blown gasket, and rebuild the engine before my dad even finished his Sunday golf game. My hands understood the language of mechanics and would long before my brain could articulate it. The defining moment of my youth, the moment that truly cemented my place in the family, happened the summer I turned 14. I spent 3 grueling, blistering months building a treehouse in the massive oak at the back of our property. But it wasn't just some flimsy platform made of scrap pallets. I had salvaged high-quality lumber from nearby residential construction sites, always asking the foreman politely, who often gave me extra supplies because they respected my hustle. I built a legitimate 2-story structure. It had framed windows, a cantilevered deck, a shingled roof, and proper load-bearing joists. Neighbors would stop their evening walks just to marvel at it. Mr. Jenkins, a retired structural engineer who lived 3 doors down, brought me a cold soda one afternoon, inspected my joints, and told me he hadn't seen such natural craftsmanship in 30 years. For a brief, naive moment, my chest swelled with pride. I genuinely thought, this is it. This is the thing that will finally make my dad proud of me. The day I finished, sweeping the last bit of sawdust off the deck, I sprinted into the house and practically dragged my father outside to see it. He stood at the base of the oak tree, dressed in his tailored suit, holding his leather briefcase. He glanced up. He didn't climb the ladder. He didn't ask how I calculated the weight distribution. He looked at it for exactly 10 seconds, checked his Rolex, and sighed. "Well," Robert said, his voice dripping with casual disdain, "I hope you're done playing with wood now. Summer's almost over, Arthur. Real men use their brains, not just their sweat. You need to focus on getting your grades up. Otherwise, you'll end up swinging a hammer for some guy like me for the rest of your life." He turned and walked inside. It felt like he had taken a crowbar directly to my ribs. That was the day I realized that in my family, manual labor, no matter how skilled or beautiful, was viewed as a symptom of a lesser mind. I was a second-class citizen in my own home. High school only widened the agonizing chasm between Kevin and me. Kevin's bedroom transformed into a shrine of elite achievement, trophies, plaques, and eventually, the ultimate prize, an early decision acceptance letter to Yale University. When that letter arrived, my parents lost their minds. They threw a massive, catered party in our backyard. They rented a tent. They hired a string quartet. My father stood on our patio, his arm draped heavily over Kevin's shoulders, his face flushed with expensive scotch and unadulterated pride. "To my son, the Yale man," he toasted to the crowd of bankers and realtors. Later that evening, he tossed Kevin the keys to a brand-new silver Audi. "You'll need reliable, respectable transportation in New Haven," he declared. I spent that entire party hiding in the kitchen, silently washing the catering dishes, completely invisible. 4 years earlier, when I had graduated high school, there was no catered tent. There was a forced, tense dinner at a local steakhouse where my mother complained about the service the entire time. My graduation gift was a used laptop my dad's bank was cycling out of inventory. Why? Because I wasn't going to a traditional 4-year university. I had been accepted into a highly respected technical college with a rigorous construction management and advanced carpentry program. When I had announced my decision to attend trade school, the reaction was nothing short of apocalyptic. "A trade school?" Eleanor had gasped, dropping her fork onto her china plate as if I had just announced I was joining a street gang. "Arthur, we did not raise our son to be a dirty blue-collar worker. What am I supposed to tell the girls at the country club? That my son is a carpenter?" The absolute horror in her voice, the way she spat the word carpenter like a slur, burned itself into my memory. The bitter, pathetic irony that she made her living selling houses built by men exactly like me was completely lost on her. "Construction management isn't a real degree, Arthur." Robert had chimed in, his tone final and authoritative. "It's a glorified certificate for people who can't handle real academics. You're settling for the bottom of the barrel. We will not fund this embarrassment." And they didn't. They cut me off financially the day I turned 18. Are you kidding me right now? Cutting off your own kid because he wants to learn a highly skilled, incredibly lucrative trade? The absolute snobbery. She sells houses but looks down on the guys who build them? Make it make sense. How would you even look at your parents after that? I started trade school with absolutely zero support. Every single penny of my tuition came from my meager savings and a punishing work schedule. I took classes during the day and worked evenings and weekends at a massive hardware store, constantly covered in dust and smelling of industrial adhesive. Meanwhile, Kevin's every conceivable expense at Yale was covered: tuition, luxury off-campus housing, meal plans, textbooks, and an absurdly generous allowance. He never knew the cold, gnawing panic of wondering if he could afford groceries for the week. But despite the bone-deep exhaustion, I thrived. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who spoke my language. My instructors, grizzled veterans of the construction industry, recognized my raw talent immediately. I wasn't just good at the physical labor. I understood the business side, the estimating, the supply chain logistics, the project management. I graduated at the absolute top of my class. My parents did not attend my graduation. Kevin had a regional tennis tournament that weekend, and my mother texted me to say they just couldn't make the logistics work. I read that text sitting alone in my rented cap and gown, crumpled my phone into my pocket, and swore I would never expect anything from them again. I immediately secured a job as an assistant project manager at a highly respected local commercial firm. It was grueling work, but I was absorbing knowledge like a sponge. And it was there, covered in drywall dust and sweating through my high-vis vest, that I met Maggie. Maggie was a nursing student who worked evenings at the local hospital and picked up weekend shifts delivering catering to construction sites to pay her tuition. We literally collided on a Tuesday afternoon. I was carrying a massive stack of blueprints and a poorly balanced cup of black coffee. She was carrying a tray of sandwiches. The coffee spilled everywhere, mostly down the front of my only clean work shirt. Instead of getting angry, she dropped her tray, grabbed a towel from her apron, and started aggressively scrubbing my chest while laughing hysterically. "Well, that's one way to get my attention, buddy," she had joked, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Maggie was everything my family wasn't. She was grounded, fiercely independent, and utterly unimpressed by wealth or status. On our first real date at a cheap diner, I nervously tried to hide my hands under the table. They were heavily calloused, scarred from slipped chisels, and permanently stained with wood finish. My mother used to look at my hands with visible disgust. But Maggie reached across the sticky formica table, grabbed my hands, and pulled them into the light. She traced the thick calluses with her thumb. "These are the hands of a man who actually builds things," she said softly, looking me right in the eye. "My grandfather was a mason. These are honorable hands, Arthur." I nearly broke down crying right there in the diner. Unlike my parents, Maggie never once questioned whether my ambitions to own my own firm were worthy. She just asked how she could help me carry the load. We were two people fighting our way up from the bottom, fueled by grit and mutual respect. We moved into a tiny, drafty one-bedroom apartment to save money. My parents never visited. "That neighborhood is a little rough for my Mercedes," my mother had casually remarked when I invited them for dinner. What she really meant was that my life wasn't affluent enough to exist in her reality. By the time I hit 30, I had spent years mastering my craft, saving every agonizingly earned dollar, and studying the market. I finally took the terrifying leap and officially launched Arthur's Custom Builds. I started with nothing but a beat-up Ford F-150, a garage packed with tools I'd accumulated over a decade, and an unshakable work ethic. The early days were a brutal test of endurance. I was the estimator, the project manager, the lead carpenter, the accountant, and the janitor. I worked 14-hour days, coming home to Maggie smelling of sweat and sawdust, falling asleep at the kitchen table while reviewing ledger books. Maggie, who was now a registered nurse, became our primary breadwinner during those lean first months, working grueling double shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on and the truck fueled. Slowly, my reputation for obsessive quality and absolute integrity began to spread. I wasn't just slapping up drywall. I was doing intricate, high-end woodwork that required precision. But I hit a massive wall. To take the company to the next level, I needed to secure bonding and buy a specific set of heavy equipment to bid on a lucrative historic renovation contract. It was the job that could put my company on the map. To do it, I needed a $50,000 small business loan. It wasn't a massive amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but to me it was a mountain. I spent 3 weeks preparing my business plan. My credit was flawless. My profit margins, though small, were incredibly consistent. I had collateral in my equipment. I walked into a prominent local bank, a competitor to the one my father worked for, deliberately avoiding his territory, wearing my one cheap suit, carrying a meticulously organized binder. The initial meeting with the commercial loan officer, a young guy named Davis, went incredibly well. He looked over my numbers, praised my profit-loss projections, and virtually guaranteed the approval. "This is a solid file, Arthur. We love backing hardworking local guys like you. I'll push this through underwriting. Expect a call by Friday." I went out and celebrated with Maggie that night. We split a cheap bottle of wine, practically buzzing with excitement. This was our breakthrough. Friday came and went. No call. Monday passed. On Wednesday, I finally got Davis on the phone. His voice was completely different, tight, nervous, and evasive. Arthur, listen. I'm sorry, but we have to decline the application. The floor dropped out from under me. Decline? Davis, you said my file was bulletproof. My credit is a 780. I have the collateral. What happened in underwriting? There was a long, excruciating pause on the line. I could hear Davis shifting uncomfortably in his leather chair. Arthur, it's complicated. You're considered a high-risk liability in this specific sector. Our risk management team decided to pass. I can't say anything more. I'm sorry. And he hung up. I was devastated. I sat in my truck in the bank parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to fight off a panic attack. Without that loan, I couldn't take the historic renovation job. My business would stagnate. But my gut told me something was deeply wrong. Bankers don't do sudden 180-degree turns on solid files without a catalyst. 2 days later, I went back to the branch, determined to get a straight answer. I waited until 5 p.m., when Davis was walking to his car in the parking garage. I intercepted him. Davis, please. Man to man. You're killing my business. I just need to know what the hell is wrong with my numbers so I can fix it. Davis looked around the empty concrete garage, his face pale and conflicted. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. It's not your numbers, Arthur. God, I shouldn't be telling you this. If this gets out, I lose my job. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. Your father is Robert, right? Senior VP over at Sterling National. My blood ran ice cold. Yes. Arthur. Your dad plays golf every Sunday with our regional vice president of underwriting. Last weekend, your name came up. According to my boss, your father explicitly told him that you were a severe flight risk. He said your business was a chaotic mess, that you lacked the intellectual capacity to manage cash flow, and that you were secretly drowning in off-book debt. He told our VP, as a professional courtesy between bankers, to deny your application. I stopped breathing. The concrete walls of the garage seemed to spin. Why? I choked out. Why would he do that? Davis looked at me with deep pity. Your dad told him that you needed to be taught a lesson about the real world, that you needed to fail hard so you'd give up this blue-collar fantasy, come crawling back to him, and accept an entry-level desk job he arranged for you at Sterling. He actively blackballed you, Arthur. In this town's banking circle, a senior VP's word is gospel. Nobody is going to touch your paper now. My jaw is literally on the floor. He didn't just withhold support. He weaponized his power at the bank to bankrupt his own flesh and blood. This isn't just toxic parenting. This is straight-up financial abuse. You can see his father is absolutely spiraling because his son didn't conform to his snobby country club aesthetic. Have you guys ever seen a parent try to actively destroy their kid's life like this? I don't remember the drive home. The betrayal was so absolute, so monstrous, that it bypassed anger and went straight into a profound, terrifying numbness. My own father hadn't just withheld his support. He had weaponized his power to actively strangle my livelihood. He wanted to crush my spirit, bankrupt me, and force me to my knees just so he could mold me into a compliant, white-collar drone that fit his country club aesthetic. I stumbled into our apartment, pale and shaking. Maggie was in her scrubs, making dinner. She took one look at my face and dropped the spatula. Arthur? Honey, what happened? I collapsed into the cheap dining chair and told her everything. The tears I had held back for 30 years finally broke. I wept in my wife's arms not for the money, but for the realization that my father genuinely despised me. He wanted to destroy me just to prove he was right. It's over, Mag, I sobbed, burying my face in my rough hands. He poisoned the well. I can't get the bond. I lose the contract. I lose the business. Maggie didn't cry. Her jaw set, her eyes hardening with a fierce, terrifying resolve. She didn't say a word. She walked into our bedroom, went to her jewelry box, and pulled out the only thing of immense value we owned. A stunning, 2-carat antique diamond ring. It had been her grandmother's, passed down to her on her 18th birthday. It was supposed to be our future daughter's heirloom. She walked back into the kitchen and slammed the velvet box onto the table. Maggie, no. Absolutely not, I said, jumping up. Shut up, Arthur, she commanded, her voice vibrating with fierce intensity. You listen to me. Your father thinks he can play God with your life because he wears a suit and sits in a glass office. He thinks money is the only power in this world. He's wrong. Grit is power. Loyalty is power. She pushed the box into my chest. We are going to a private lender tomorrow. We are using this as collateral. You are going to get that bond, you are going to take that historic renovation, and you are going to build an empire that casts a shadow so big it suffocates your father's ego. You hear me? We do not crawl for people who try to break our legs. I held the ring box, my tears soaking the velvet. Right then and there, looking into my wife's blazing eyes, the wounded boy inside me died permanently. What replaced him was a man forged in cold, hard steel. I swore a silent oath that I would succeed so massively, so undeniably, that the sheer weight of my success would become my vengeance. I took the ring. I secured a high-interest private loan. I won the contract. And I never breathed a word to my parents that I knew what my father had done. I was waiting for the right moment. That moment arrived 6 months later, right around Thanksgiving. My business had survived the initial hurdle and was slowly catching its breath, though Maggie and I were still living on ramen noodles and picking up extra shifts to pay down the predatory interest on the private loan. My parents summoned us to their home for dinner. Not invited, summoned. Maggie had almost refused to go, still harboring a volcanic rage toward Robert, but I asked her to trust me. I needed to look him in the eye one more time as a man. When we arrived, the house smelled of expensive cedar wood and roasting lamb. Kevin was already there, holding a glass of $200 Cabernet, looking remarkably smug in a tailored designer suit. He had recently graduated from Yale Law School and landed an associate position at a cutthroat corporate firm in Manhattan. The entire dinner was a nauseating performance of wealth and elitism. Robert grilled Kevin about his billable hours and the high-profile partners he was rubbing elbows with. Eleanor wanted to know every detail about the exclusive nightclubs Kevin was getting into. Maggie and I sat at the end of the long mahogany table, virtually silent, eating off fine china that felt like it belonged in a museum rather than a home. Finally, as dessert was being served, Robert clinked his silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. He stood up, his face glowing with that familiar, arrogant pride. Eleanor and I have a very special announcement to make, Robert began, looking proudly at Kevin. As you all know, Kevin has positioned himself beautifully for a spectacular career in New York. However, the real estate market in Manhattan is vicious. A man of Kevin's caliber needs an appropriate address to entertain clients and maintain his professional trajectory. He paused for dramatic effect. So, your mother and I have decided to reward his hard work. We have just wired Kevin $135,000 for the down payment on a luxury condo overlooking Central Park. To the Yale man. The audacity to announce this at dinner while Arthur and Maggie are sitting right there. Surviving on ramen and working extra shifts, $135,000 for a condo. While Arthur was literally begging for a $50,000 business loan that Robert deliberately blocked. I would have flipped that mahogany table over. What would you have done in Arthur's shoes right here? To Kevin, Eleanor cheered, raising her glass. The dining room fell dead silent. Maggie's fork clattered loudly onto her plate. I just sat there, staring at my father, waiting for the second half of the speech. The part where they acknowledged their other son, sitting 10 feet away, who had been bleeding and sweating for every dime he had. It never came. Maggie couldn't contain it anymore. Her face was flushed red with righteous anger. What about Arthur? She asked, her voice tight, slicing through the celebratory atmosphere like a scalpel. My parents looked at her as if she had just tracked dog feces onto their Persian rug. What about him, Maggie? Robert asked coldly, setting his wine glass down. We have been married for years. We live in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, Maggie said, her voice rising, trembling with suppressed fury. Arthur works harder in one day than most people do in a month. His business is growing, but we are drowning in overhead because we have absolutely zero safety net. Are you planning to help us with a down payment, too? Even a fraction of $135,000 would literally change our lives. Eleanor scoffed, a delicate, condescending sound. Maggie, dear, that's entirely different. Kevin is a corporate attorney. He has a real career. He needs this to advance in society. Arthur chose an alternative path. I finally found my voice. It was dangerously calm. Are you saying you won't help us because I'm a contractor, Dad? Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, fixing me with a look of absolute, unapologetic contempt. Let's be brutally honest, Arthur. Why on earth would we reward failure? Kevin listened to our guidance. He went to a top-tier university, secured a prestigious position, and is moving up in the world. You explicitly rejected our advice. You chose to be a laborer. You made your bed, Arthur. Now lie in it. Failure. He actually said the word out loud. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had built homes, the hands that were currently fighting to keep my family afloat. Then I looked up at the man who shared my DNA. You're right, Robert, I said, standing up slowly. The use of his first name made him flinch. I made my bed, but you didn't just refuse to help me make it. You actively tried to set it on fire while I was sleeping in it. Robert frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. What kind of melodramatic nonsense are you talking about? I leaned across the table, planting my calloused hands on the polished mahogany, bringing my face inches from his. My voice dropped to a lethal whisper. Sterling National, Regional VP of Underwriting. I know about the phone call, Robert. I know you personally sabotaged my $50,000 business loan to bankrupt me. I know you tried to destroy my company to force me into crawling back to you for a desk job. The color completely drained from Robert's face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Even Kevin looked shocked, staring at our father in disbelief. For a split second, I saw panic in Robert's eyes. But his narcissism was too deeply ingrained. He quickly recovered, his jaw setting defensively. I was trying to teach you a lesson about the real world. You were in over your head, Arthur. I was doing you a favor by shutting down that ridiculous fantasy before you ruined yourself entirely. You are a monster, Maggie spat out, standing up so violently her chair crashed backward to the floor. You are a small, arrogant, pathetic little man. I walked around the table, grabbed Maggie's coat, and draped it over her shoulders. I looked at Eleanor, who was staring at me wide-eyed, and then back at Robert. You didn't teach me a lesson about the real world, Robert. You taught me that I don't have a father. Enjoy your country club. Enjoy your $135,000 condo. You have no son named Arthur anymore. If you ever contact me, my wife, or attempt to interfere with my business again, I will make sure the banking commission hears exactly how a senior VP uses his position to orchestrate personal vendettas. I didn't wait for a response. I took Maggie's hand, and we walked out the front door into the freezing November night. We didn't look back. That was the last time I spoke to my family for 3 years. The aftermath of cutting contact was unlike anything I had ever experienced. There was a profound, hollow grief for the family I realized I was never going to have. But more than that, there was an explosive, terrifying liberation. The suffocating weight of constantly seeking my parents' unearnable approval had been severed. I took all that rage, all that betrayal, all the humiliation of sitting at that mahogany table, and I funneled it directly into a nuclear reactor of ambition. I stopped trying to just survive in my business. I decided I was going to conquer. My 3-year business plan was violently compressed into a 1-year, sleep-deprived sprint. I started taking on the most complex, demanding custom woodwork and renovation projects in the state, jobs other contractors were too scared to touch. Maggie and I lived like hermits. We didn't take vacations, we didn't eat at restaurants, we didn't buy new clothes. Every single dollar of profit was viciously reinvested back into the company, paying off that private loan and upgrading my equipment. I found a mentor in George, a grizzled, 68-year-old master builder who had run the local market for 4 decades. He saw my drive, took me under his wing, and taught me the intricacies of scaling a high-end construction firm. When George decided to retire, he bypassed his own useless nephews and sold his prestigious client list and legacy branding directly to me. Arthur's Custom Builds wasn't just surviving anymore. It was rapidly becoming the gold standard for luxury construction in the region. But the real turning point, the physical manifestation of my vengeance and my freedom, happened 18 months after the dinner. I found a piece of property that everyone else had written off. It was a massive, 7-acre parcel of land situated about 40 minutes outside the city limits. It was heavily wooded, incredibly steep, and practically inaccessible. Developers had passed on it for years because the cost of clearing an access road and leveling a build site was considered financial suicide. The asking price was ridiculously low. Where others saw a barren, logistical nightmare, I saw a fortress. I saw a place where no one in a tailored suit and a silver Audi would ever bother me. I liquidated my personal savings and bought it in cash. Maggie thought I was slightly crazy, but she never doubted me. "If anyone can conquer that mountain, it's you, Arthur," she had said, looking over the intimidating topography maps spread across our small kitchen table. The next year was the most physically agonizing period of my life. During the day, I was running a multi-million-dollar contracting business, managing crews, and negotiating with architects. But at night and every single weekend, I was on that mountain. George lent me his old, diesel-spewing bulldozer. I taught myself how to operate it under the harsh glare of halogen work lights. I spent hundreds of hours in the pitch-black, freezing rain, and sweltering humidity, tearing down dead trees, moving literal tons of earth, and carving a winding half-mile access road up the steep grade. There were nights my hands cramped so violently I couldn't uncurl my fingers from the joysticks of the dozer. There were mornings I woke up in the cab of my truck, covered in mud and diesel grease, too exhausted to drive back to the apartment. But every time my muscles screamed for me to quit, every time I thought about giving up and selling the land, I would see Robert's arrogant face in the dark. I would hear his voice. "Why would we reward failure?" That memory was like injecting pure adrenaline into my veins. I would fire up the diesel engine and push another ton of dirt. Eventually, the road was cut. The build site was leveled, sitting perfectly on a high ridge that offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the wooded valley below. I poured the massive concrete foundation myself, aided by a few of my most loyal crewmen who worked on weekends just for beer and the sheer respect of what we were trying to accomplish. I designed the home to be an absolute masterpiece. It wasn't some cookie-cutter McMansion built to impress country club snobs. It was a 3,500-square-foot, authentic craftsman estate. Every massive timber beam was hand-selected and milled. The stonework was sourced locally and laid with meticulous precision. I built a massive, state-of-the-art woodworking shop right on the property, turning the land into the official, permanent headquarters of my company. It took 2 years of bleeding, sweating, and pouring every ounce of my soul into that dirt. But as I stood on the massive, wraparound cedar deck on a crisp autumn morning, holding a cup of coffee and looking out over the 7-acre empire I had carved out of the wilderness with my own 2 hands, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in my entire 30-plus years of existence. Absolute, untouchable peace. I was a man who had built his own kingdom from the dirt up. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their approval. And I certainly didn't need their name. I had won. Or at least I thought the war was over. I had no idea that my past was about to come crashing through the gates of my sanctuary. 3 years. That is exactly how long I existed as a ghost to the people who shared my last name. 3 years of absolute, unbroken silence. In that time, while Robert and Eleanor were undoubtedly sitting in their pristine, sterile dining room, sipping expensive wine and likely telling their country club friends some fabricated sob story about their wayward, estranged son, I was busy building a reality they couldn't even fathom. Arthur's Custom Builds didn't just grow. It exploded. By my 3rd year of independence, my company had become the premier, most sought-after private contracting firm for luxury, custom-built estates in the entire tri-state area. I had a crew of 25 full-time, fiercely loyal men. These were guys who knew the value of a hard day's work, men who showed up at dawn with calloused hands and left at dusk covered in sawdust and pride. We weren't just slapping together prefabricated McMansions. We were practicing a dying art. We did hand-hewn timber framing, intricate custom masonry, and bespoke architectural woodwork that commanded top-tier premiums. And the crown jewel of it all was my own home, the 7-acre, steep, wooded mountain lot that every developer had laughed at was now a breathtaking sanctuary. I had tamed the mountain. The house sat perfectly on the ridge, a sprawling, 3,500-square-foot craftsman masterpiece made entirely of natural stone, deep cedar siding, and massive, exposed walnut beams that I had milled myself. It featured an enormous wrap-around deck that looked out over a pristine, unbroken valley of green. 100 yards from the main house, hidden by a row of ancient pines, sat my massive, state-of-the-art woodworking shop and the official headquarters for Arthur's Custom Builds. I didn't owe a single dime to any bank for this property. The land, the materials, the equipment. Every nail and every stone was paid for in cash, earned entirely by the sweat of my brow and the unwavering support of my wife. Maggie, my absolute rock, had also found her triumph. While I was conquering the mountain, she had been promoted to head charge nurse of the pediatric wing at the region's largest hospital. We would sit on our cedar deck in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the tree line, utterly exhausted but profoundly at peace. There was no screaming, no belittling, no impossible standards of fake, upper-class perfection to meet. We had built our own world, a fortress of genuine love and hard work, completely insulated from the toxic elitism of my family. Our ultimate validation, however, came from the outside world. A prominent national architecture and design magazine caught wind of my personal home through one of my wealthy clients. They sent a photography crew out to the mountain. 2 months later, my home, my shop, and my story were featured in a massive, 8-page spread titled, "The Empire Built from Dirt, One Master Builder's Mountain Sanctuary." The article raved about the unparalleled craftsmanship, the structural integrity of the timber framing, and the sheer grit it took to carve such a paradise out of an unbuildable steep grade. There were high-definition photos of my calloused hands resting on a custom-built walnut dining table, photos of the massive stone fireplace, and a beautiful shot of Maggie and me standing in front of the house. I bought one copy of that magazine, read it once, and tossed it into a drawer in my office. I didn't frame it. I didn't post it on social media to brag, because true power, true masculinity, doesn't need to scream for attention. I knew what I had accomplished, and that was enough for me. But as fate would have it, the universe has a very funny, very brutal way of forcing the truth into the light. The silence I had cultivated for 3 years was about to be shattered, and it wasn't going to start with my father. It was going to start with the golden child. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon in late August. I was in the main shop wearing a dust mask and ear protection, running a massive slab of raw oak through the industrial planer. The roar of the machine was deafening, blocking out the rest of the world. Down at the bottom of the mountain, about a half-mile away from my front door, Kevin was having the worst day of his week. He had driven out to the rural counties to meet with a reclusive, ultra-wealthy tech client regarding a complex tax shelter trust. GPS signals in the deep woods were notoriously unreliable, and Kevin, stressed and rushing in his silver Audi, took a wrong turn off the main county highway. He drove up a winding, heavily wooded private access road, completely lost, frantically tapping his navigation screen. He rounded a steep bend and suddenly found himself forced to hit the brakes. Rising up before him were massive, custom-forged iron gates, flanked by 2 towering pillars of hand-laid river stone, and bolted directly into the stone, cast in heavy, dark bronze, was a massive plaque that read, "Arthur's Custom Builds, World Headquarters and Private Estate." According to what Kevin told me later, he literally put his car in park, stepped out onto the asphalt, and stared at the gates for 5 full minutes, his brain completely unable to process what his eyes were seeing. Beyond the gates, the paved driveway snaked up the mountain, revealing glimpses of the sprawling, magazine-worthy craftsman mansion, and the massive, professional-grade workshop facility. Landscaping crews were meticulously trimming the grounds. Heavy-duty company trucks, all bearing my logo, were parked neatly in the designated commercial lot. This was the same brother who, 3 years ago at a Thanksgiving table, was told he was a pathetic failure who made his bed in the dirt. This was the brother my father had proudly claimed would end up bankrupt and begging for a desk job. Kevin pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking. He dialed our father's private office line at the bank. When Robert picked up, Kevin didn't even say hello. "Dad," Kevin breathed into the phone, his voice a frantic, high-pitched whisper of pure disbelief. "Dad, you need to get down here right now. I think we've made a terrible mistake. You have no idea what Arthur has built." Robert, sitting in his glass office 30 miles away, was annoyed. "Kevin, what are you talking about? Where are you?" "I'm looking at a fortress, Dad. A literal estate. Arthur didn't fail. He conquered the whole damn mountain." "Oh man. Sweet, sweet karma." The golden child accidentally discovering the multi-million-dollar fortress built by the quote-unquote pathetic failure. You can just picture Kevin completely unhinged right now, realizing his entire Wall Street life is a massive scam compared to what his brother built from the dirt. That evening, just as the sun was setting and the crew had gone home, I was sweeping up the shop floor when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I walked out to the main driveway and saw a silver Audi slowly pulling up to the house. The driver's side door opened, and Kevin stepped out. I hadn't seen my brother in 3 years. The man standing before me was barely recognizable as the smug, arrogant golden boy who had confidently accepted a $135,000 handout for a Manhattan condo. He was 32 years old but looked 45. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive tailored suit, but it hung loosely on his frame, as if he had lost 15 pounds of muscle. His skin was pale, carrying a sickly, grayish undertone. The dark, heavy bags under his eyes spoke of chronic, agonizing sleep deprivation. He just stood there in the driveway, looking up at the towering timber beams of my home, looking at the massive shop, and finally, looking at me. I was wearing stained Carhartt work pants, a sweat-soaked t-shirt, and steel-toed boots. I didn't yell. I didn't cross my arms and gloat. I just rested my hands on my hips and said, "You look lost, Kevin." "Arthur," he croaked out. His voice broke completely. I got lost. The GPS." He couldn't finish the sentence. To my absolute shock, Kevin's shoulders collapsed, his face crumpled, and he started to openly, heavily weep right there in my driveway. The polished corporate attorney completely disintegrated. I walked over, put a heavy hand on his shoulder, and guided him up the stone steps onto the cedar deck. Maggie came out of the house, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She saw Kevin, saw the state he was in, and her maternal, nursing instincts immediately overrode her past anger. She went inside and brought out a glass of cold water and a chair. For the next 2 hours, sitting on the deck as the stars came out, the dam broke. Kevin spilled his guts. He confessed everything. "Now I'm drowning Arthur," Kevin sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "That perfect life they wanted for me, the one they paid for, it's killing me slowly. It's a prison." He told us about the nightmare of Wall Street corporate law. He was working 100 hours a week, surviving on a terrifying cocktail of high-grade espresso, anti-anxiety medications, and prescription sleep aids just to function. The prestigious $135,000 condo down payment from our parents had locked him into an astronomical mortgage that devoured his entire, supposedly massive salary. The culture at his firm was toxic, cutthroat, and completely devoid of human morality. He spent his days finding legal loopholes for billionaires to hide their wealth. "My girlfriend left me 4 months ago," Kevin admitted, staring blankly at the wooden floorboards. "She said I was an empty shell of a human being. And she was right. I don't produce anything. I don't build anything. I just move invisible money around a screen to make rich men richer. I have a Yale degree, a Rolex, and a Manhattan address, and I have never been more miserable in my entire life. When I saw your gates today, Arthur, I was so profoundly jealous of you, I thought my chest was going to cave in. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. You built something real. You have a legacy. I have absolutely nothing. I sat back in my chair and looked at my younger brother. 3 years ago, I would have paid money to see him this utterly broken. I would have relished the schadenfreude of the golden child falling off his pedestal. But sitting there now, as a man who had already won his own wars, I felt no joy in his suffering. I just saw a victim. Kevin wasn't the architect of his misery. Robert and Eleanor were. They had molded him into a trophy, and now the trophy was cracking under the pressure. A lesser man would have laughed and told him to get off the property. But true strength isn't about crushing people who are already on their knees. It's about having the power to destroy someone and choosing to build them up instead. Kevin, look at me, I said, my voice low and steady. He lifted his tear-stained face. You're 32. You're not dead. But if you stay on that hamster wheel, you will be in 5 years. What else can I do? He asked desperately. It's all I know. I'm a lawyer in golden handcuffs. You're smart with numbers. You understand complex contracts. You understand tax law and corporate structuring. I listed off. My company is pulling in 8 figures in gross revenue now. I am a builder, Kevin. I am not a guy who likes sitting behind a desk arguing with commercial insurance adjusters, running payroll logistics, or handling corporate tax strategy. I need an executive. I need a chief financial officer. Kevin stared at me, his jaw literally dropping. Arthur, are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a fresh start, I corrected him. The pay will be a massive step down from your Wall Street salary, but you'll work normal hours. You'll sweat. You'll be part of a team that actually creates something tangible, something that will outlast us both. And most importantly, you won't have to answer to Robert anymore. Kevin didn't even hesitate. He didn't ask about the exact salary or the benefits package. He stood up, walked over to me, and wrapped me in a crushing, desperate hug. It was the first time my brother had hugged me since we were little kids. The real explosion, however, happened 3 weeks later. Maggie and I were hosting a massive end-of-summer barbecue for my entire construction crew on our property. Kevin had driven down for the weekend. Without telling me, Kevin had done the unthinkable. He had called our parents and invited them to my house. He told them he had a major life announcement to make and insisted they come to the address he provided. When Robert's pristine black Mercedes S-Class rolled through my iron gates, I could practically feel the shockwave radiating from the vehicle. They parked near the shop and stepped out. Robert was wearing a casual polo shirt that cost more than a drywaller's weekly paycheck. Eleanor had her designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly coiffed hair. They walked up the stone pathway, their eyes darting wildly over the massive estate, the dozens of parked trucks, and the massive crowd of men drinking beer and eating barbecue on the deck. They looked completely disoriented, as if they had stepped onto another planet. They hadn't seen the magazine article yet. They genuinely believed I was still living in a cramped apartment, scraping by on pennies. I stood near the massive outdoor grill, holding a pair of tongs, watching them approach. I didn't greet them. I didn't smile. I just let them take it all in. Before Robert could even formulate a sentence to ask how I had managed to break into someone else's luxury estate, Kevin stepped forward to the center of the patio. He cleared his throat loudly, drawing the attention of my crew and our parents. Mom, Dad, thank you for driving out here, Kevin said, his voice surprisingly steady. The dark bags under his eyes were already starting to fade. I asked you here because I wanted you to hear this directly from me, in front of the man who saved my life. Robert frowned, crossing his arms. Kevin, what is this about? And what are we doing at Arthur's? Whatever this is Arthur's empire. Dad? Kevin said clearly, his voice carrying over the crowd. And as of yesterday, it's also my new workplace. I have officially resigned from my firm in Manhattan. I have listed the condo you helped me buy on the market, and I will be returning your $135,000 down payment from the equity of the sale. I am walking away from Wall Street. I have accepted a position as the chief financial officer of Arthur's Custom Builds. The absolute silence that fell over the deck was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop on the cedar planks. Eleanor gasped, clutching her chest as if she had just been shot. Kevin, no, you can't be serious. You are a Yale-educated corporate attorney. You are throwing away your entire future, your prestige, for this. She waved her hand dismissively at my crew of rugged, bearded carpenters and masons. Robert's face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He took a menacing step toward Kevin. You are out of your goddamn mind, Robert hissed, his voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated rage. You're throwing away an Ivy League education to work in the dirt? For him? For a failed carpenter? I will not allow this. I will cut off every dime of financial assistance you receive. I will freeze your trust fund. You will be a pariah in our family. Kevin didn't flinch. He stood tall, looking our father dead in the eye, and delivered the single greatest verbal execution I have ever witnessed. Keep your money, Dad. Keep your trust fund. And keep your country club, Kevin said, his voice ringing with newfound masculine authority. Arthur built an empire out of dirt, sweat, and absolute integrity. You built a house of lies, manipulation, and ego. I'd rather be a laborer in Arthur's kingdom than a prince in your prison. Let's go, Kevin. He finally broke out of the brainwashing. Telling his dad he'd rather be a laborer in Arthur's kingdom than a prince in his prison is the most epic mic drop I've ever heard. Robert's ego just got shattered into a million tiny little country club pieces. What do you even say back to that? Robert looked like he had been struck by lightning. The absolute humiliation of being dressed down by his golden child, in front of 30 blue-collar workers and his estranged son, broke him. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at Kevin. You are dead to me. Both of you are dead to me. Come, Eleanor. We are leaving. They practically ran back to their Mercedes, the tires spinning on the gravel as they sped out of my gates. As the taillights disappeared down the mountain, my entire crew erupted into a massive, roaring cheer. I walked over to Kevin, handed him an ice-cold beer, and clinked my bottle against his. He was finally free. A full year passed after that explosive barbecue. True to his word, Kevin moved to a modest apartment in town, rolled up his sleeves, and completely revolutionized the back-end financials of my company. With Kevin handling the complex tax structuring, the commercial insurance negotiations, and the massive supply chain logistics, I was freed up to do what I did best: build masterpieces. Our profit margins soared. We were an unstoppable team. The brotherly bond we had been denied as children was finally forged in the fires of actual meaningful work. And then came the absolute pinnacle of my professional career. I had just finished the largest, most complex contract my company had ever undertaken. It was a $5 million, ultramodern luxury compound built onto the edge of a cliff overlooking a massive lake for a famous regional tech CEO. It was an architectural marvel of glass, steel, and my signature custom timber framing. To celebrate the completion, and to generate high-end leads, the client allowed us to host a private, invitation-only showcase gala at the property before they moved in. We catered the event with high-end food and an open bar. The guest list was a who's who of the region's elite: local politicians, wealthy developers, hospital board members, and, crucially, senior executives from all the major regional banks. I was in my element. I wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a stuffy suit. I wore a crisp, tailored black button-down shirt, dark jeans, and clean leather boots. I stood in the massive, vaulted great room, holding a glass of club soda, surrounded by a group of wealthy investors who were hanging on to my every word as I explained the load-bearing capacity of the cantilevered steel balcony. And then, like a bad penny turning up in a gold vault, I saw them. Robert and Eleanor walked through the massive double doors of the foyer. They hadn't been invited. But in circles of wealth, people like my parents always find a way to slip past the velvet rope. They had obviously seen the architecture magazine feature by now. They knew exactly what I was worth. I watched from across the room, my jaw tightening. Eleanor immediately went to work. I saw her spot a group of wealthy women from her real estate circles. She marched right up to them, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered on her face, and pointed directly at me across the room. I could read her lips. Yes, that's my son, Arthur. He built this entire place. We are just so incredibly proud of our boy's vision. It made me physically nauseous. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of a woman who had once called my profession dirty and embarrassing, now trying to siphon social currency from my sweat and blood. Then I saw Robert spot me. He straightened his expensive silk tie, grabbed 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter, and began to weave his way through the crowd toward me. He pasted on a look of practiced, paternal warmth that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He approached my circle. The investors, recognizing the senior banker, nodded respectfully and stepped back, allowing us a moment. "Arthur, my boy," Robert said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding VIPs to hear. He offered me one of the champagne flutes. "Absolutely magnificent work. Truly. Your mother and I are simply blown away by this property." I didn't take the glass. I just looked at his hand, then up at his face. "You aren't on the guest list, Robert." Robert chuckled. A smooth, practiced sound, brushing off the cold reception. He stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice into what he thought was a conspiratorial, father-son tone. "Arthur, listen. I know things have been heated between us in the past. Blood runs hot, as they say. But watching you tonight, seeing the empire you've built, I am man enough to admit when I've misjudged a situation." He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes scanning the room full of millionaires. "Perhaps Eleanor and I were hasty in our assessment of your career path. You've clearly proven yourself in the real world." He paused, waiting for me to fall into his arms, starved for the validation I had craved as a 14-year-old boy. When I remained completely silent, he pressed on. "We are family, Arthur, and family shouldn't be estranged, especially not when we could be a formidable team. With your construction dominance and my banking network, the synergy would be incredible. We should put the past behind us. We should focus on moving forward, together." Moving forward. He wasn't apologizing for the abuse. He wasn't apologizing for the emotional neglect. He was trying to execute a hostile takeover of my success because I had finally generated enough capital to be useful to him. He wanted to parade me around the country club, introduce me to his banking buddies, and pretend he was the guiding hand behind the master builder. I didn't lose my temper. I didn't scream or throw a punch. Rage is the weapon of a man who lacks control. Absolute, ice-cold calmness is the weapon of a king. I looked at Robert, then I looked past him to the center of the great room. There was a small, elevated landing near the grand staircase. I walked past him, stepping up onto the landing. I tapped a spoon against my glass of club soda. The sharp ringing cut through the chatter, and within seconds, the massive room fell completely silent. 200 of the most powerful people in the region turned their attention to me. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice projecting clearly across the vaulted space. "Building a home like this is never the work of one man. It requires a brotherhood." I gestured to my crew, who were grouped near the bar. "To my carpenters, my masons, my electricians. You are the lifeblood of this company. Thank you." The crowd offered a warm round of applause. "I also want to publicly thank my chief financial officer and my brother, Kevin." I pointed to Kevin, who was standing tall in a sharp suit, smiling genuinely. Kevin walked away from a highly lucrative career on Wall Street to come get his boots muddy with me. He brought order to my chaos, and this company's exponential growth is directly tied to his brilliance. More applause, louder this time. "But most importantly," I continued, looking down at the front row of the crowd where Maggie stood. She was wearing a beautiful emerald green dress, her hand resting gently on her slightly rounded stomach. "I want to thank my wife, Maggie. Years ago, when we had absolutely nothing, when my company was on the brink of collapse and I couldn't secure a dime of funding, she quietly sold her grandmother's antique diamond ring to keep the lights on. She believed in me when the rest of the world turned its back. And tonight, I am beyond honored to announce that in 6 months, she is going to make me a father." The room erupted into cheers and joyful applause. I stepped down off the landing, kissed Maggie softly, and then turned. The smile vanished from my face. I walked purposefully through the crowd, heading directly straight for Robert. The VIPs, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, naturally parted like the Red Sea. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him. Eleanor had materialized by his side, sensing the tension. Several of Robert's banking colleagues and rival executives were standing well within earshot, watching us intently. "Arthur, really, a beautiful speech?" Robert whispered, trying to maintain his public smile, though sweat was visibly beading on his forehead. "Now, as I was saying, about us moving forward?" "Moving forward?" I repeated. My voice was low, but in the hushed, attentive silence of the surrounding crowd, it carried like a gunshot. "Yes, moving forward as a family," Robert urged, his eyes darting nervously to the regional VP of his rival bank, who was standing just 5 feet away, listening closely. The man who secretly, maliciously sabotages his own son's business loan application does not get to move forward when that son succeeds in spite of him, I said, my words slicing through the air like razor blades. The collective intake of breath from the surrounding bankers and elites was audible. Robert's public smile shattered. He went chalk white. "Arthur, lower your voice," he hissed in a panicked whisper. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about, Robert. I know that 4 years ago, you used your position as a senior VP at Sterling National to illegally strong-arm a rival underwriter into denying my $50,000 commercial bond. You tried to bankrupt your own flesh and blood. You tried to crush my company just to force me into submission because you thought my work was beneath your social status." Eleanor let out a horrified, muffled sob, burying her face in her hands. The executives standing around us were staring at Robert with a mixture of shock and absolute disgust. In their world of high finance, weaponizing your bank's influence for a petty personal vendetta wasn't just unethical. It was professional suicide. "You wanted me to fail, Robert?" I said, my voice as cold and hard as the stone pillars holding up the ceiling. "And now you want to stand in a $5 million house that I built, drink free champagne, and pretend you had a hand in my success. You don't. You are a coward. You are a fraud. And you are no father to me." I stepped back, pointing a calloused, scarred finger toward the massive oak front doors. "Leave my property, and never, ever approach me, my brother, or my pregnant wife again." Robert stood paralyzed for a torturous 5 seconds. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the men he played golf with, the men whose respect he desperately craved. They all looked away. His power, his carefully curated illusion of the perfect, elite patriarch, was completely and utterly annihilated. His shoulders slumped. He looked suddenly small, old, and incredibly pathetic. Without saying a single word, he took Eleanor by the elbow, turned around, and walked out the front doors into the night. Yes, that is exactly how you obliterate a narcissist. Exposing his illegal banking corruption in front of the very people he spent his entire pathetic life trying to impress. He walked out of there a broken, empty man, and he absolutely deserved every single second of it. Would you have exposed him publicly like this? The silence lingered for a moment, and then Kevin walked up beside me, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. We looked at each other, the unspoken weight of a lifetime of trauma finally, permanently lifted. We didn't need to say anything. It was done. The story ends right where it should. Not in a boardroom, not in a country club, but in the place where true value is created. It was a quiet Sunday morning, a few months after the showcase. The sun was streaming through the massive windows of my workshop on the mountain. The smell of fresh-cut cedar filled the air. Kevin was at a drafting table in the corner, reviewing our quarterly profit margins with a cup of black coffee, looking healthier and happier than he had in a decade. I was standing at my main workbench, wearing my leather apron, my hands covered in sawdust. I was meticulously hand-sanding the intricate spindles of a solid maple crib. My child's crib. I ran my callous thumb over the smooth wood, feeling the grain, knowing that every joint was flawless, every measurement exact. I thought about the lessons I would teach my son or daughter. I wouldn't teach them to worship money. I wouldn't teach them to judge a man by the label on his suit or the neighborhood he lived in. I would teach them that true respect is earned in the dirt. I would teach them that a man's worth is measured by his integrity, by how fiercely he protects the people he loves, and by the undeniable quality of the things he builds with his own 2 hands. My parents tried to break me by handing my brother a fortune and leaving me with nothing but my sweat and a hammer. But what they didn't understand is that when you build a man from the ground up, out of hardship and raw determination, you build a foundation that $135,000 could never buy. You build something that lasts forever. What an absolute legend Arthur is. This story hits so hard because it shows the vile reality of status-obsessed parents. Robert and Eleanor didn't love their sons. They loved the optics of their sons. They treated human beings like accessories to match their Audi and their golf club memberships. The fact that Robert went out of his way to illegally block a tiny $50,000 loan just to break his own kid's spirit is pure, concentrated evil. He wanted to starve Arthur into submission, but Arthur took that betrayal and forged it into an untouchable empire. And let's be real, Kevin's redemption arc was beautiful. He realized the golden cage was still a cage, and he chose brotherhood over fake prestige. This is a massive win for the underdogs. User BigTimber88 says, Arthur went too far at the gala. Robert is still his dad, and humiliating him in front of his bank rivals was just petty revenge. YTA. Are we reading the same story, BigTimber88? Petty revenge? Robert literally tried to ruin Arthur's life and bankrupt him. He tried to destroy a man's livelihood just to say, I told you so. Exposing a corrupt banker to his peers isn't petty. It's a public service. Arthur didn't start the fire, he just let Robert burn in the one he set himself. User Night Shift Nurse replies, we are ignoring the real MVP here. Maggie offering up her grandmother's heirloom ring without a second thought to save his business is top-tier wife material. Spot on, Night Shift Nurse. Maggie is the absolute backbone of this story. She saw the grit in Arthur when his own blood treated him like dirt. She didn't flinch when things got rough. That's what real partnership looks like. Not whatever fake, transactional marriage Robert and Eleanor have going on.